Welcome everyone. Thank you to Malvern Books for hosting the 8th interview in this series, Borderless, Conversations on Art, Action, and Justice. I hope after the talk that you'll stick around and buy some books, including Monica's book, and my book is also on sale over there. I started Borderless, Conversations on Art, Action, and Justice in January of 2017. It's about the power of words and the role of art in reflecting and changing our world. In this interview series, I talk to emerging and established writers about how and why they write and why it matters. This is a series about breaking down borders between people, between forms of expression, between identities and nations, between art and action, and as my first guest, Nikki Llewellyn, said during the Q&A, it's also about breaking down the borders in our own minds. So my guest tonight, I'm very excited, is award-winning author, educator, and public historian, Monica Munoz Martinez. She's a national authority on the history of race, and an Andrew Carnegie Fellow and the Stanley J. Bernstein Assistant Professor of American Studies and Ethnic Studies at Brown University. Her research specializes in histories of violence, policing on the U.S.-Mexico border, Latinx history, women and gender studies, and public humanities. Born and raised in Texas, Martinez received her PhD in American Studies from Yale University. Dr. Martinez is the author of The Injustice Never Leaves You, Anti-Mexican Violence in Texas. As Texas Monthly writes, Martinez has written a book that bravely and convincingly urges us to think differently about Texas's past. But she has also written a book that tells us something about the future we are creating right now. Please join me in welcoming Monica Munoz Martinez. So we're going to talk a little bit, and then Monica is going to read to you a little bit from the book. So I wanted to ask you a little bit. So in this book, you concentrate on this period between 1910 and 1920, and you really draw a full picture of, like I'm not seeing this side of the room, you really draw a full picture of the backdrop of the violence that was going on in Texas at that time. But you highlight 3 particular cases. So the first one in 1910 is the lynching of Antonio Rodriguez in Rockport, Texas. And then you have the 1915 double murder of 2 Mexican ranchers, Jesus Bazan and Antonio Longoria, by Captain Ransom of the Texas Rangers. And then the third story is the Porvenir massacre of 15 men and boys who were separated out from a group, I believe, while they were sleeping, woken up and slaughtered, and that was in 1918. Can you talk a little bit about how you came to the structure of the book, and if you, how you came to anchor it in these 3 stories, or if that's what you were trying to do?
Yes, absolutely. Well, thank you so much for the invitation and for the generous question to talk broadly about the structure of the book. And this, I must say, I've seen this in pictures online, but it's something else to be here. So I'm so happy to be here with you all. Thank you for joining us on Friday evening. But I selected these 3 cases, the lynching of Antonio Rodriguez in Rock Springs, Texas in 1910, and the double murder of Jesus Bazan and Antonio Longoria, and the Porvenir massacre in 1918, because it helped me to tell different versions of the same story that brought together the point that histories of racial violence and injustices of this form don't just stay in the past, that they stay and impact wide groups of communities, it encompasses entire communities, these kinds of violence, but also that it expands to impact generations of people through time. And so the story of the lynching of Antonio Rodriguez is the story of a Mexican national who doesn't have roots in Rock Springs. He's a migrant worker, and he's accused of murdering Effie Henderson, who was an Anglo ranch wife in Rock Springs. And so that allowed me to tell the story of the ways in which this lynching captivated the national news and captivated not just people locally, but internationally. There was coverage of this lynching. But 100 years later, people were continuing in that town and in local areas of Texas had kept the memory of Antonio Rodriguez alive, but there was nobody in Rock Springs that was related to him. And so it was a history that shook the community and continued to impact race relations 100 years later. The story of Antonio Longoria and Jesus Bazan in 1915 is a very different story because both of the men were part of a landed Tejano elite. They were married, they had families, they owned their property. Antonio Longoria was an elected official, the Hidalgo County Commissioner. And so these two men were murdered in 1915 without any repercussions. There was no investigation, there was no media coverage, there were no public protests. And so here were two men who were a central part of the fabric, the social fabric in South Texas, and they could be eliminated without consequence. And yet, the memory of that injustice had continued to stay with the families of Jesus Bazan and Antonio Longoria and was passed from family to family. So that was a gripping story that allowed me to talk about the injustice of that kind of violence. And as a reminder that citizenship and class in this era did not protect Mexicans, ethnic Mexicans, from violence. And the third case of the Borderless massacre was such an important and compelling case, not only because it was such an atrocious example of racial violence, that there was this ranching community, some of the families owned property, others had been there for long periods of time, but there were families that were woken in the middle of the night, and the young boys and men, 15, were separated from their families and they were executed, they were massacred in police custody. And that was a story that disrupted, ended this community. Would have ceased to exist really after this. But the families did not just vanish, never to be heard from again, which is how some people had told this story. And it was actually allowed me to tell the story of how the survivors of the massacre, what they did to survive in the massacre, in the aftermath. I mean, they literally crossed the border in the hours after the massacre, crossed the border into Mexico to seek safety, right? This is while Mexico is in the throes of the Mexican Revolution. And they end up, through a series of efforts, trying to seek justice. And so it allowed me to tell the stories of these different cases, allowed me to give profiles of the different kinds of racial violence that people suffered from, but it also allowed me to to explore the different strategies that were available for people seeking justice. And in this case, you had survivors who ended up filing a court case against the United States government for this gross injustice. And so I used those three cases to help they signify, they're signals for broader histories that get to the complexity of the issues.
Right, so I have a lot of questions, more than we have time for, but Ellen, could you read us a little bit of the book so we could just hear? It's a really beautifully written book, I mean, as well as being just a living history. So I'm just curious, how many people have read it? So a lot of you are in for a treat.
Okay, so I'm just going to start with I thought about a few different sections, but I'm going to start with the introduction of the book. Because it helps to lay out some of the important themes that mattered in the writing of the book. It was an otherwise ordinary day in early April 1918, but Miguel Garcia, a Mexican national living in Texas, was growing concerned. His son Florencio, 25 years old, had not yet returned home from his job as a cattle herder in Cameron County. Garcia started walking through town, asking relatives, friends, neighbors, and eventually even the county attorney and local law enforcement officers if they had seen Florencio. Days passed without news. Then someone told Garcia that Texas Rangers had arrested Florencio over a week earlier on April 5th, just south of Brownsville. Garcia knew that when ethnic Mexicans disappeared after being arrested, the prisoners' remains were often found hidden in a grove of mesquite trees in the rural Texas landscape. This grim news prompted Garcia to start searching the brush in the countryside for his son's remains. Miguel Garcia repeatedly asked for help from local authorities. Oscar Dancy, the Cameron County attorney, remembered Garcia's persistence. Quote, "The old man, the father of the boy, was at my office. He was at my office 2 or 3 times and my residence once." Weeks later, local residents found human remains outside of Brownsville. We found the bones of a human being, Dancy would later testify. We found a pair of pants and a jumper, and as I recollect it, a shirt, black hair, and a hat, a light Texas cowboy Stetson hat. He remembered, adding that there were bullet holes through the jacket, 2, perhaps 3. The clothing matched the description Miguel Garcia had previously provided, and the investigation suggested that the body had been shot in the back 3 times. The remains consisted only of clothes, a skull with a tuft of hair, and bones scattered as far as 300 yards, likely by coyotes or buzzards. Garcia arrived at the scene and identified the shoes, hat, and clothing as belonging to Florencio. The father pulled a monographed handkerchief out of the jacket they had discovered and verified that it was his son's. So I started the book with that event because it goes on, as the historical record reveals, it goes on to show that Florencio Garcia's father, Miguel, went to great lengths, and his family went to great lengths to try to find their son, to find the remains of their son, and to have a death certificate issued for their son, Florencio, so that they could bury the remains. And so it becomes a really important practice that families took on their own as a small measure of justice. In this case, was literally just to try to find the remains of their loved ones. And in cases where, the vast majority of these cases, people weren't able to, people weren't prosecuted for these crimes, but having that moment of closure, having the opportunity to bury the dead, provided some important recourse. And so there's just one last section that thinks about the importance of this. I wrote later in the introduction, this book highlights the long efforts to reckon with loss and shows that mourning can be a practice of resistance, passed from generation to generation, continuing even a century later. Remembering the names of the dead and the names of those who brought them harm is a crucial and ongoing effort in the struggle against state violence. Such enduring efforts, often in direct opposition to popular memory, testify to the value of connecting truthfully with the past. The families who have reckoned with this violence harbor a lesson we all should heed. We must reckon with the fact that the southern border of our country was created and policed violently and not valiantly, and that we have continually suppressed this truer, more accurate past. It is a past that bleeds into the present, a suppression that continues to shape our future.
I'm glad you read that section. I love that line, the past that bleeds into the present. I think there's just not really a better way of putting that. That leads into my next question, actually. I was very moved by how these people in the book, some of them are survivors of the violence, or descendants. Some of them were just, it seems like, people who noticed an erasure of history and wanted to correct it. And I was very moved by the steps that they took to uncover this history. People seem to have some sense of the importance of documenting, recording. And you talk a little bit about people engaging in critical memories. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what that means. And then if you could, when you started talking to some of these people, what were some of the ways that they shared these critical memories with you?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's a complicated question. On the one hand, the idea of just remembering the names of the dead was a really important practice for families who had seen that not only their loved ones could be murdered and tossed into the brush without recourse, without there being any sort of investigation, but that there was also an effort to disavow that death mattered. And so in the case of, so I looked at different media reports and photographs of this era, and what was quite common was that when there were accountings of people being murdered, especially when they came at the hands of police, they were being criminalized and they were being described as bandits. And so it was a way of disavowing the humanity of that person. It was a way of justifying the shootings. And so there was this broader practice of trying to dehumanize the victims. And really because of the cloak of the authority of law enforcement being behind some of, a good number of the murders, it was difficult for families trying to expose the state-sanctioned acts of violence. And so for those families to, like Florencio's family, to insist that there be an investigation, that they find the resources, and in many cases, families had to rely on the generosity of Mexican consuls, if the victim was a Mexican national, to try to call for investigations. But in terms of their efforts to remember the names of the people who died and the lives that were interrupted, that was one really important way of speaking back to that effort to criminalize them. Because if you look at the records that were left behind by the state police, if they document that they shot somebody in their custody, they frequently just describe them as bandit or horse thief or somebody resisting arrest. And so being able to compare that account by a Texas Ranger with the investigation from a Mexican consul, who's able to say, here's the name of the parents, here's the name of the wife, here's the testimonies of 2 witnesses that saw this person in police custody before they were disappeared. That allows you to actually to read the police records critically rather than just taking them as truth. In some cases, there are very few records that give us access to what happened. And so in those cases, the family histories that have been preserved and passed on can be one of the only ways of trying to figure out what happened. And so in that case, we might learn that somebody was murdered or shot on a certain particular date. And we might not be able to get all of the details of what actually took place, but we know that somebody lived, and we know that they, at some point, were killed. And so what we can do then is try to put together the pieces of the family history of who that person was before they died, and tell the story of the aftermath of how those communities were impacted by the loss of that person. And so remembering the name of somebody, remembering what they were like and how they were appreciated or relied upon by their families, it also prompts us to ask about how people survived in the wake of these kinds of acts of brutality and terror.
We should say that, so you talk about a kind of trifecta of perpetrators. So there were the Texas Rangers, which were like the main policing force, that's what I gathered, and then the military and the militarization of the border was already happening at that time. And then there was like mob violence. And it seems that that had a dual purpose, like the social control of the ethnic Mexican population, and the establishment of Anglo dominance. Is that a accurate way of looking at it, or was there something else going on?
Well, there's a lot going on, because in the early 20th century, this is a history of colonization of the Southwest. And so what you really have in this era is this effort. What you have in South Texas is, the railroad arrives in Brownsville in 1904. And so it opens up South Texas and the valley for agricultural farming. And so you have a wave of recruitment, efforts to recruit Anglo farmers to move into South Texas and to do a few things, which is to convert the land from Mexican farming, from Mexican ranching practices, which really use open open land practices. If I have a ranch with cattle and you have a neighboring ranch with cattle, you know, there isn't a fence between us with Mexican land practices. Anglo farmers that start coming in the late 19th century, but especially in the early 20th century into South Texas, they bring in their practices of using barbed wire fences to enclose their farms. And so that disrupts the movement of cattle. So if I'm a Mexican rancher that has cattle, but the water's on your property and you put up a fence, then I can't graze my cattle on your land and to get access to the water. So there's deep-seated tensions about the way that land should be used and how property should be fenced or not fenced and policed. That happens before there's discussions about actually putting up a fence on the border, right? I mean, like, that's not the conversation, it's about private property. But there's also, with this influx of Anglo migration into South Texas, you have people who are bringing their ideas about race with them. And so for Anglo ranchers who are farmers who are coming from the South or coming from, from places like Chicago, they're bringing their ideas of how races are supposed to interact. And so they introduce what is called in South Texas Juan Crow laws of segregation. So Jim Crow era style laws to segregate communities, to keep Black and Anglos living separately. They bring similar laws to Texas to disenfranchise Mexicans from voting, to keep them out of schools, and to create a new racial and economic hierarchy, which is to displace Mexican landowners and a political and cultural and economic elite and replace that with Anglo-controlled societies. And so this is a longer, complicated history that goes back all the way to the U.S.-Mexico War that ends in 1848, but also a much longer history of colonization of this era. So some of the people who were being displaced in the early 20th century that are Tejanos have been able to trace their land back to Spanish land grants, right? So there's layered histories of colonization that are taking place here. But to get back to your question about, in this decade, those racial tensions are also being magnified because there are calls to police to patrol the border, because there's a sense that the Mexican Revolution, which is ongoing between 1910 and 1920, that there's a threat of that revolution crossing over into the United States. And so what you start to see is the criminalization of Mexicans in this era as being bandits, as being threats to the nation state, but also in this era, I use the term in the book, ethnic Mexican. And it's clunky in a lot of ways. It's not my favorite term, but it encompasses people of ethnic Mexican descent who have American citizenship, and those that are Mexican nationals that are living in South Texas. And so in this era, it didn't matter what your citizenship was. If you looked Mexican or spoke Spanish, you were profiled as Mexican and you were deemed a threat. And so I think this is this moment where you see these intersecting policing regimes. And so socially people are being policed, not to intermarry, not to enter schools, not to vote. But you also have this intersecting regimes of policing in a more direct sense, that you have local law enforcement, the Texas Ranger, which are the state police, and you have the influx, troops that are being sent to the U.S.-Mexico border, over 100,000, and they're primarily in Texas. And these soldiers are training to be deployed for World War I. So they're also training learning how to use the newest military technologies before they go to World War I. So, and in terms of a military strategy, a lot of the, it was an important moment of nation building for the U.S. government to say, as a nation, we can police our borders and we can protect our borders. But also it was an important practice because for these soldiers from Rhode Island, in Brown University, I read these soldiers' letters from home, describing places like El Paso and Brownsville. And it's like a foreign world to them. For somebody who grew up in Rhode Island, to go to South Texas, and so they're like, this is a foreign terrain for our soldiers to train on before they are deployed. And that actually has a much longer history too of soldiers going and training in places like Hawaii. So the ways in which the practices of policing here are multiple.
Yeah, so you really build a very complex picture of what was going on materially that contributed to all these forces and contentions over different things. I was in that period between 1910 and 1920. I thought it was interesting. In 1915, Birth of a Nation came out. There was the revival of the Klan around the same time, and then a lot of the Confederate monuments that I believe people need to be tearing down right now were put up in that period. And you just get a Texas specific, but you also get a national picture of what was going on in World War I. I wanted to ask you, there's something, I think that we're in this epistemological crisis right now, right, where people deny that there's true, the president denies that there's actual truth or his version of the truth, and there are a lot of people who, the whole concept of truth is a little, under question. And, but there was something there were a couple of very important quotes. There's a section where you talk about this documentary, Border Bandits, which is sort of, I need to go find that documentary. But it was this man's attempt to sort of redress some of the ways that this history was told. And so he showed this, was it in like 2015 or I don't remember the exact year, but it was not that long ago.
2004, 2002.
Okay. So he was showing this around, and there was, it seemed like it really broke open a whole, debate, and just, it opened up a lot of people's eyes to the actual history of the Texas Rangers and the violence. But then there was this one guy who was offended by the retelling of this history, and he said, well, there's two sides to every story. And I thought, I think you even mentioned in that that's a cliche, but it's also a fallacy. It's not that you're just telling another side of the story. You're actually uncovering a truth that was buried. And then you also make this really important point towards the end, and I think this may be towards our last question before we open it up to the audience, but you said, we saw earlier how vernacular history making, and I think by that you mean sort of the stories that have emerged since, how vernacular history making can reckon with histories of violence, but the practice can also result in individuals perpetuating oppressive versions of history. Vernacular histories are sometimes displayed not to bring about healing or to recover erased histories, but instead to maintain unjust social norms and divisions. And I think that's just a very important thing for people to understand, and there may be some vernacular history makers here in this audience, but this is something maybe we can learn from historians. How do you recognize what's true? And how do you go about getting to the truth? I know that's a big question.
Mm-hmm. I think people need to read more history. But I think there's also, there's a call for a need for people to think critically about the myths that we live with and are really surrounded by, especially, everywhere, but Texas. I mean, it's so deep here. But I think, and this also comes back to your point about the time of 1915 and the historians talk about this as really the development of this idea of what it means to be Texan, right? There's not just the Birth of the Nation film, but there's a film about the Alamo that is equally, the Birth of the Nation is like the trope of like the savage black man that needs to be controlled with violence, that is propaganda, white supremacist propaganda that is played not only across Texas, but on the U.S. Capitol is played, right? So, but this film about the Alamo also has these really deeply racist scripts where it's, you know, the white Anglos who are victims to Mexican savagery. And so that is so deeply entrenched. And one of the ways that I think that we can think about the ways that those myths are creating is by turning back to this period. And and some people think that parts of the book are too detailed, but there were some parts of the sections of chapters that I just insisted remain. And it's these parts of the chapters where I actually show and talk in detail about what Texas Rangers said happened and what the other evidence shows us that they're not telling the truth, that they are creating a fiction, that they are covering up their crimes. And the opening, the first introduction with Florencio Garcia gives us an example. You know, there's a death certificate that's offered for him, his family buries him, and in 1919 and during the hearing of a state investigation into the abuse by the Texas Rangers, you have Texas Ranger captains coming back and saying, nothing happened to him, he actually just crossed the river, he's living in Mexico, he wanted to abandon his family. And so a year later, you know, months after he's been buried and this death certificate has been issued, you still have these Texas Rangers who are saying, Florencio Garcia is alive and well. This family's just stirring up trouble. But if you only rely on that testimony and on the reports from the Texas Rangers, then you could write a story that says this was another just, you know, this is just local residents stirring up trouble trying to place blame on the Texas Rangers. And historians like Walter Prescott Webb, who is like a few blocks from here, you know, on Guadalupe, and I forgot, by the San Antonio Garage, you know, there's the Walter Prescott Webb Hall. And, you know, he's all over this campus, but he writes the history of the Texas Rangers that celebrates them, that turns them into heroes. And not only does he publish his book in 1935, right, which is a year before the Texas Centennial, not of when Texas becomes a member of the United States, but it's the centennial of Texas independence from Mexico, right? So all of this like Texas pride that we're celebrating right now, Texas History Month, like March 1st was Texas Independence Day. That's independence from Mexico, right? Like that's not like the U.S. Revolution from England. That's not about like the United States independence. That's Texas independence from Mexico. So it's that deeply rooted. But what he does is he writes this book of the Texas Rangers in 1935. Then he leads the commission that organizes the Texas Centennial, which places 1,000 monuments across the state. You know, it has the big exposition in Dallas. And he sells the movie rights of his book to Hollywood so that you have all of these portrayals of the Texas Rangers in these films. And so that's how you get the myth. And so some of these families that I call vernacular history makers, in some cases, they're the families of the descendants that have done the work to go back to the archives, to write their own family histories that confront and challenge the state archives. But they have had to battle because they will present their history in public, or they will tell their story to their friend, and their friend will say, well, your granddaddy must have been abandoned, which is what one of Norma Longoria Rodriguez's friends told her. And so she wrote poetry, she wrote her family history, she put it online. And you know, Kirby Warnock, who made the documentary Border Bandits, he confronted a lot of opposition from Texas Ranger enthusiasts who said, this is just, you know, it was a bad part of Texas Ranger history. Why are you focusing on that? But if you go to the Texas Ranger History Museum in Waco, you know, some of these Texas Rangers are there on display, or their rifles are on display, or some of the Texas Rangers that committed these brutalities against indigenous people in the 19th century, they are in the Hall of Fame. And so I think what we have to do is think critically about the myths, think critically about who we are being asked to celebrate, and not to be afraid of having difficult conversations.
I do have more questions. I'm all for giving up the myths that are holding humanity back. I have one more question, but I'm going to ask it after I give the audience a chance to.
I haven't read your book, Monica, but I know you've started to answer this, but I want to get in a little deeper. You chose to focus on 1910 to 1920. It sounds like the railroad reaching Brownsville. There were certain reasons that was really your focus. Of course, there was intense anti-Mexican violence before that, and there has been in the decades since. And so I just want you to talk a little bit more about that as a kind of, just as a writer and a historian, how that drew your focus and you decided to cut away, obviously you can't write one book about all of it. How did you get to that decade?
Well, in some ways, I wanted to expand out of 1915.
Okay.
So this period of anti-Mexican violence, historians have for a long time looked at this as the peak in 1915 as being the most important moment in being able to talk about not just mob violence, but state violence. And so bringing in the case of Antonio Rodriguez, he's burned alive at the stake in November 1910 before the start of the Mexican Revolution. So that's important for reminding people this kind of violence was happening because speaking back to the myths that were created, there are historians that have justified this period of violence by saying this was just the state responding to violent Mexicans that were threatening the nation. They were Mexican revolutionaries, they were bandits, and so this is a response to that violence. And so it was violence to confront violence. But if you look at the case of 1910, right, this is mob violence that has been taking place throughout the 19th century, right? So people look at the peak of violence after the U.S.-Mexico War, mob violence against Mexicanos across the U.S. This wasn't just in Texas. But also 1918, the Colonization massacre is really important because too many historians who have been critical of the Texas Rangers say there was this peak of violence and then it subsided. And it didn't. And people continued to be lynched, and police continued to murder people after the investigation into the Texas Rangers in 1919. So one of the ways, so the fourth chapter of the book looks at this investigation to the Texas Rangers, but it also looks at, and it threads together this moment in 1919 when the Texas state governor is being confronted by people like Jose T. Canales, who's a state rep from Brownsville, and he calls for this hearing, this investigation to the Texas Rangers because the abuse is becoming so widespread. But then, the governor's also being confronted by the NAACP, by local chapters across Texas and the national NAACP that are like, Texas is ranked 3rd in the nation for the lynchings of African Americans, right? It also has the highest numbers of lynchings of Mexicans. So when you add those numbers together, Texas is deep in mob violence. But it's this moment in which the state is being confronted by efforts to end lynching culture and efforts to curb police murder. And so what happens is the state reduces the number of the Texas Rangers, but it doesn't call for prosecutions. And the governor, rather than trying to, publicly he makes statements about how lynching culture needs to end in Texas. But behind the scenes, he's actually calling on his Texas Rangers to go and intimidate NAACP chapters. So I look at violence, I chose cases that help us to move beyond 1915 and help us move past this idea that the violence was focused then, but also to say there's this earlier period of violence that we have to learn about to understand what happened to Antonio Rodriguez. And 1919 was a moment of possibility, but as a result, of the state upholding white supremacy, not prosecuting state police violence, but also closing NAACP chapters. So the state has, I think it's 21 chapters across the state in 1919. By 1921, it's down to 7. And then you have the rise of the Ku Klux Klan. Texans elect a U.S. senator who was a card-carrying member of the Ku Klux Klan in the 20s. Right, in 1923, Texans celebrate Ku Klux Klan Day. It is a state holiday. So in many ways, looking at this decade, I try to do it critically so that it says, like, it opens up to these institutions of policing. There's also a state senator here that I write about in that 4th chapter, Hudspeth, Claude Benton Hudspeth. Hudspeth County, he's the namesake of Hudspeth County. You know, he calls for mob violence from the stand in 1919 and says, I will come down from Washington and lead a mob if I have to. You have to shoot Mexicans when you see them. And he later in 1924, when the United States passes the 1924 Immigration Act, he adds $1 million rider to that piece of immigration legislation to fund the U.S. Border Patrol. Right, so part of it is even though I focus in 1910 and 1920, so much about this book is saying we've only just started to come to terms with and trace how this period of state-sanctioned violence has impacted policing in the United States, what justice looks like for people who are victims of police violence, but also what then is used as the model for how the border should be policed and who's the target of that policing. So the families that do this vernacular history making are having to confront all of that.
You can see the direct line to today. I mean, you talk about the technology, the machine guns, the barbed wire, how that gave certain people an advantage. You know, it was bandits back then, it's MS-13 now, right? How many times does Trump talk about MS-13? And then the 1919 case, I think, is really, I thought it was interesting that you led there because every police murder sort of ends in this like sort of sham theater investigation or, you know, some trial or something that could be an opportunity or a possibility that doesn't go anywhere. And in 1919, it's really draw out how much possibility was lost in that investigation. And that leads to another question I have, but I should get some more questions from out here. Yes.
Yes, you mentioned the railroad going to Brownsville in 1904 and the effort to recruit Anglos to move into the valley. Were you able to document the specific number of Anglos that actually relocated to buy the property and begin commercial farming in the valley?
Yes. You know, the best work on that still, I think, is David Montejano, who has his book that looks at this more expansive history of the ways in which Texas was changed by Anglo-Mexican relations. He is a historian, but he was also trained as a sociologist. So he did an incredible amount of work going back to census records, going back to land maps, to show this shift in property. So I have some of that in the book as context. But in terms of looking at the demographic shifts, he's really the book to go to. But certainly, it's astounding how quickly racial power shifts. So, you know, once the introduction of barbed wire, once barbed wire is invented in 1874, right, it's brought to Texas. Texas is one of the first places where, you know, the producers of barbed wire come, because Anglo farmers want a cheap way of enclosing their property. And so barbed wire is lightweight. It can be shipped easily on a train, and so it's quick to put up. But in terms of, so, you know, in the 1870s, from between 1870 to 1910, you know, you can essentially say that South Texas has been completely enclosed. And so, and you also have the introduction not only of the railroad, but of irrigation systems. And so, and there's a whole series of ways in which this massive amounts of land was transferred from from Mexican hands to Anglo hands. So it wasn't just farmers coming in and buying it, but, you know, the ways in, you know, there was taxation of property. There were lawyers, you know, people, Tejanos that owned property that were able to trace their land back to Spanish land grants had to show deeds that they didn't own because they didn't have U.S. deeds for their land, and so there was this legal structure and these challenges to Tejanos and whether or not they were the rightful landowners. And so people lost land not just through the courts and through taxation, but also through violence. And so there were some families that were able to maintain their property, like Bazan and Longoria, but in that case, the widows, the popular saying in between 1910 and 1920 was that you don't buy from the husband, you buy from the widow. And so it was this common practice. It was commonly known that if you wanted a property and the landowner wasn't willing to sell, you could murder him and intimidate the wife, and very likely she would leave the property or sell it quickly. Epigmenia Bazan and Antonia Longoria did not leave their land. They stayed, and because they stayed, we know more about their family history. And their family, one of the ways in which they were vernacular history makers was not just recording their own family oral histories, writing about their family history, but Richard Martinez, who's one of the descendants, he lives on the land and he has preserved the homestead that Antonio Longoria and his family lived in. And so we have photographs not only of the people, of the families themselves, of the widows and their daughters and their children, but we also have photographs of the homes that they lived in, and that's a tremendous testament.
Questions?
Sure. It occurred to me that during the Mexican Revolution, a lot of huge ranches and other properties were owned by American mostly, but also British and other corporations and landowners also changed hands very quickly. What connection, if any, is there between change on one side of the border and this very different kind of seizing of individual ranchers and other?
Could you say that again? So you're thinking about?
I'm just wondering if there was any connection at all, whether the reaction or no reaction. But during the Mexican Revolution and leading up to it, I think, if I'm not mistaken, a lot of land, a lot of factories, haciendas were taken over, sometimes with tactics which were, well, I guess they're different, but similarly it's produced deeds. Well, in many cases the deeds hadn't been done properly anyway, and that was on purpose, to collect the taxes. Is there any connection between what's going on with that and what's going on in the process you're describing?
In Mexico?
On the one hand in Mexico, excuse me, and on the other in Texas.
Yes, absolutely. Well, I mean, on the one hand, this gets to the politics of why the fear of the Mexican Revolution and people coming into the United States from the Mexican Revolution is so threatening. Because what animates the Mexican Revolution is an effort, well, it's, okay, getting into the history of the Mexican Revolution is really complicated. But at the heart of it, it's an effort to displace Porfirio Diaz, who had opened Mexico to foreign investment, right? So you not only have some industries like mining that are 80% foreign owned, not just US, but British companies, right? And so you have this revolution that is in name saying we are going to redistribute land that has been taken and bought by foreigners, but we're also going to nationalize these industries. And so when you have, and there were, the Plan de San Diego that took place in 1915 was only one of a long history of revolutionary efforts to challenge US and Mexican control of that region, right? So, we can think about Caterino Garza's revolution that takes place in the late 19th century, and I'm smiling because we have a descendant in the house, alive and well, and stirring up, critical thinking of the border. But that there was a revolutionary spirit. And so some of the fear that was being described was that if there are enough people that buy into this political ideology, then you're going to have people questioning American capitalism and the colonization of the Southwest. And so there's an effort to criminalize Mexicans as a threat to the nation. But what's behind that is also this fear of this radical political ideology. And so you also have moments like the Primer Congreso Mexicanista, which takes place in 1911. That's a civil rights conference that happens in Laredo. It's organized by the Hidad family, Jovita Hidad, who's not only a radical labor organizer and a teacher and a suffragist, but she and her family invite people who are invested in talking about social justice and talking about, and that, you know, are trying to address labor exploitation, disenfranchisement, segregation of Mexican children from schools, but also, you know, they're inviting people from both sides of the border. And so there are people like the Hidad family and others who have these radical ideas that the border is, that the river is a river and it should not divide Laredo from Nuevo Laredo. And for families that owned houses on one side of the border and businesses on the other, there were people who, you know, for them it was like, you're the invaders, not the Mexicans who've been living here, or my cousin who lives across the river. And so, so absolutely it's connected. But that radical, that alternative idea of land and labor and critiques of capitalism have been completely forgotten. And instead what has been remembered and circulated are these myths of a savage, wild frontier that needed to be settled. And these poor, lazy Mexicans who didn't know how to farm, and so we needed to take the land from them, secure the border, and put those poor, dumb Mexicans to work, right? So it's that tension that we want Mexicans, we want exploitable labor, but we also will call on the right to criminalize them if we need to put them in line with violence. And so that tension is ongoing today, because throughout the history of these immigration debates, you have the recruitment and calls for Mexicans to come into the United States to work for cheap, and when they're needed as a scapegoat, they are expelled through deportations, and so there's this long history of and what I mean, if you want to think about the current moment, right? That the criminalization of people who are coming into the United States, whether they're immigrants or refugees, just calling them MS-13 or just calling them a threat covers up long patterns of U.S. intervention into Central America, right? Like it covers up long patterns of U.S. exploitation and abuse and unfair economic policies, sponsorships of dictators, right? Like when Trump just ends temporary protective status, right? Like that was given to people as an apology for the United States supporting and funding killing squads in El Salvador, right? But we forget that when we just say MS-13. Like, they're so violent. We're gonna get them out of here. It's unsettling that the patterns that happened 100 years ago that are replicating in different forms today. But it's devastating. But what you get at is that, yes, like this was deeply interconnected to what was happening in Mexico.
I think I'm just going to end with a comment. And if you have more questions, we have a little bit of time to mingle. I think from this book, what I really appreciate was how much, at the end, you get a sense that we all have a role to play in confronting this history and breaking this mythology, which is actually continuing this culture of violence and this lack of resistance to what to these current power structures, and including the militarization and the criminalization of immigrants now. And so I just want to urge everyone who has not read the book, take it home, start reading it, and there's so much in this about how we can all be better, makers of critical memory, or and really, I think it is incumbent on all of us to start breaking this mythology down. So I want to thank you for talking to us, and please stay and get your book signed if you have more questions for Monica. and thank you all for being here.